you probably know today, we have Garret Schneider. He has a very distinguished career in the aerospace industry. He's got some pretty cool stuff up here, all about doing space missions and mission design, and yeah. So.
Well, thank you all for having me. My pleasure, as I was saying, to meet a bunch of fellow space cadets in New York City. It's often those two paths don't intersect. So I've just got a few charts, mainly to keep myself on track. Because God knows I can't even talk to my kids without charts. Been in this business too long. A little bit of my background, engineering in the space arena, with respect to space reliability, sensors, experiments, architecture studies, war games, program management, mainly centered around the DoD and Intel community. Intel communities, how they work, and then a couple of business development case studies, if you will, or things we tried, unfortunately unsuccessfully in my tenure with TASC and BAE Systems, but I'll go into the hows and whys about that. So my background, I've been in the space business since 1985, January of '85. When I got my master's degree, I was in the Air Force. I'm a retired Air Force officer. And they sent me to Los Angeles Air Force Base. And that was just the start of Star Wars, SDI. The money had just shown up at Space Division, then Space Division. It's now Space and Missile Systems Center, which is where the Air Force manages all of their procurement of satellites and launch vehicles. Since at the start, SDI was going to be hugely space-based. Obviously, Space Division in the Air Force and its research labs were the center of a lot of attention and a lot of money. Because the original architecture called for all of the sensors to be in space, obviously for missile warning, tracking in mid-course, as well as all of the intercept functions, either kinetic or space-based lasers. Those were in the architecture from the very start. The kinetic would be basically interceptor missiles hosted on a bus, used to shoot down missiles in mid-flight before they could reach us. Now, the particular group I was assigned to worried about the survivability or protection of all of our stuff in space, because we're going to have this huge defense architecture in orbit. And we postulated very esoteric capabilities and weapons. And of course, we had to give the bad guys credit for the same. You know, space-based lasers, big honking space-based lasers that nowadays seem a little far-fetched, but back in those days, people like Edward Teller from Lawrence Livermore, Los Alamos Labs were telling the administration, we can do all this stuff, we can build this stuff. So now we had to worry about what would the bad guys do to our assets in space, how would they try and attack us, and how would we protect those assets. So we worried about three key phenomenologies: nuclear attack, lasers, and kinetic kill of our satellites, and came up with technologies and techniques to protect them against attack. And the nuclear scenario is basically somebody sets off a nuke in space, and you don't get the blast and shock like you do terrestrially, but you get lots of radiation, lots of X-rays, lots of neutrons, lots of gammas that just eat up electronics. So we worried about how do we harden our electronics, and we still worry about that to this day on military spacecraft, and now the civilian community, or the commercial community, has learned that lesson too. Global Star in particular, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but they put up their fleet of, gosh, how many satellites, I forget now, 20-something, 24. They put it up at 1,400 kilometers, which is the hottest part of the Van Allen belts. And all of us at the time looking at their plans said, you're crazy to go into that altitude because radiation, the natural radiation, is going to eat you alive. Sure enough, they had a planned lifetime of, I think, 10 years. Their satellites started dying around 5, and at the 7-year point, they had to redo their entire fleet. So it's doable, but it's a lot of money. They had to replenish their entire fleet years ahead of plan.
They went bankrupt, right?
No, they're still in business. I've lost track of their business case, but it hurt. It hurt a lot. What that led to was a lot of technology development for what we call rad-hard electronics. That was centered out of the Air Force Research Lab in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and still is. And we also conducted underground nuclear tests to, well, you started out with exposure to radiation sources like cobalt devices, et cetera. But to get the real information, underground nuclear tests were done where you set off a nuke underground in a central chamber, and you have pipes, if you will, running out from where the bomb is, and you put your experiments at different places along those pipes, depending on the radiation flux you want to test at. So the bomb goes off, radiation goes, and now you've also got all this junk coming. It's highly radioactive from the blast itself, and you have these enormous blast doors that shut. So your electronics package gets radiated, but it doesn't get destroyed. So you just telemetry all your data out of there. There was a famous test, I forget which one, where the blast doors didn't close, and everything just got trashed. And it's just sealed up a big hole in the desert full of concrete now. But the last test was Mighty Uncle. I think it was like September 30th, 1992. And then the U.S. declared we're not going to do any more underground nuclear tests, and haven't since. Lasers come in two forms. There's the slag 'em down laser that you think of that will just melt through walls and things. It doesn't take that much to harm a satellite with that kind of laser. You don't have to melt it down. But satellites, by their very nature, operate at a very thin balance of thermal control. All you have to do is overheat it a little bit, degrade the materials a little bit, disrupt the thermal balance, and the satellite's dead, and it's not coming back. The other major concern is surveillance satellites or sensors. Sensors on satellites are just telescopes with very high optical gains. And in fact, the reconnaissance satellites, the classified ones, have incredible optical gains. And they only operate in certain bandwidths, certain micron ranges. But if you put a lot of photons into that field of view within the bandpass, it gets amplified by the optical gain and just breaks the focal plane. So we did lots and lots of lab testing with ground lasers and focal planes, and we know the effects very well of what lasers will do to sensors, optics, thin films, and the focal planes themselves. That was all centered out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and is still a concern. In fact, well, the Russians and Chinese have had lasers that can do this forever. Nowadays, even the lasers in cockpits and commercial airliners are causing problems. Little lasers can cause a lot of problem when you have an optical gain of 10 to the 6th or 10 to the 9th. And remains a problem to this day. In fact, the National Reconnaissance Office, much to my amazement, several years ago, publicly announced that the Chinese had lased one of our reconnaissance satellites just to screw with the optics. So it's no no great secret. People out there can do it. The satellites are obviously in known positions. Even the NRO birds you can figure out easily. And all you have to do is get in the field of view with not very much power, and that sensor is useless.
So what was the countermeasure?
There are a number of countermeasures, but they're all, the first thing, a physical countermeasure does not work because the effect happens at the speed of light. So trying to close the doors doesn't do you any good. You're already blinded. What you do, the primary way is using filters that reject a particular wavelength because the lasers are at known, pretty well known wavelengths. So a very strong yet thin optical film that will notch out that wavelength and let the rest of the band pass through. And those have been in production for many years. The Air Force uses them to protect pilots against battlefield lasers, rangefinders, and also missile seeker heads. There's thousands of lasers on the battlefield, but we know what their wavelengths are. So pilots and their visors have these very thin optical films that notch out known wavelengths. So it's a very small loss of the total scene, but it protects you against that laser getting through. And in fact, there's a huge hue and cry, there always has been, about lasing people on the battlefield. That's considered inhumane. You can shoot them and kill them, but lasing them in the eyes is sort of out of bounds. And that still continues to this day. The kinetic, so the first ASAT under consideration was just something that would go up and do like a shotgun blast, pellets, and take out a satellite kinetically. So we did lots of ground testing with rail guns about how to basically put out a bumper plate. So when the hypervelocity pellet hits, it splatters at that shield, that bumper plate, and then the spall behind it is of much lower velocity and less density to protect whatever is behind it. And you don't need big standoff distances, it can be like this. And the space station uses that today, just to because of the natural environment. But there was a lot of work along those lines that was largely centered around University of Dayton. Did a lot of research, and with Nick Johnson, of course, the NASA guru underbreed, and Darren McKnight worked for us as well. And we also considered active techniques. So these were all passive. Active is if you think they're going to shoot at you, move someplace else, disrupt their aim. Put up decoys so they don't know which one to go at. If you see something coming up at you, shoot it down before it gets to you. Just distribute the architecture, have multiple sensors, which has problems of its own back then and even now. How do you coordinate and integrate all these disparate satellites? But that was all part of the trade space, part of the architecture. These get very expensive, very expensive. So the desire was to rely more on the passive techniques than the active. But in the end, it's always a mix and driven by budget as well. So we, in fact, we did, let me go on to a couple of other specifics. So at the start, SDIO, the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization, was very space-oriented. Around 1993 or so, transitioned over, basically when the Clinton administration came in, to more ground-based defenses than space-based defenses. And the emphasis went from space to ground-based missiles. Up until that time, 8 or 10 years before then, it was a real heyday for space guys, because all the money was going towards space capabilities. And a couple of things that I was involved in was what we call MISTY series, Miniature Sensor Technology Integration. There were sensor experiments trying new cheap sensors. And in fact, MISTY 3, which gained some notoriety, was about the size of a small refrigerator. Sensor was built by SAIC in San Diego. The bus was built by Spectrum Astro. Had a very good lifetime. Gathered a lot of data, and then towards the end of its life, we said, so we got this satellite, and we got all these lasers on the ground. Let's try an actual experiment of lasing the sensor in space to see, to extrapolate from the ground-based data we had. And so we actually shot MISTY with the Miracle laser from White Sands. That caused a huge hubbub. We were trying to keep it very quiet. Word got out. We conducted the experiment anyway. Afterwards, the fact of the experiment was open knowledge. Generated a letter from Boris Yeltsin to President Clinton saying, "What the hell are you doing?" And so we had to respond. That was the Dear Bill letter, so we responded with the Dear Boris letter and said, no, this was not an ASAT test, this was a sensor test, which didn't violate the ABM treaty or anything like that, but it caused a lot of concern. But we got very good data out of it. Now, there are two lasers at Miracle facility. Miracle itself is in the megawatt class, and it's a DF laser, 3.8 microns. If we hit the sensor with that, it would just be destroyed, period. We wanted to look at low power effects to see how it would dazzle, what we call dazzle a sensor, yet not destroy it. Because we figured that is the more likely scenario for someone to interfere with our sensing capabilities. Because if you don't break it, the other side can't get that mad at you. So we didn't shoot it with the megawatt laser. There's a low power tracking laser that the facility uses to find the target and lock onto it, and then they slave the main beam accordingly. So it's the low power laser that we put in the eyes of the sensor and got some very good data. The data, of course, was classified, but the fact of the experiment isn't anymore. In fact, you can look it up on Wikipedia and DoD press releases and all that kind of stuff. But it was a huge to-do at the time.
Why do you think you lost operational security in that situation?
An individual from Spectrum Astro, I won't repeat his name, I can't stand to speak it. Spectrum Astro wanted to get the satellite after end of life, when it still had, or end of mission, when it still had a useful life. They were worried that this experiment would kill it. So they publicly said DoD is planning on doing this because they wanted to get the satellite instead of possibly it being killed. So yeah, there's a total operational security violation. They got punished pretty bad for that. But since we weren't performing an ASAT mission, it was a sensor experiment to validate the extrapolation from ground tests. It was all right. The fewer cooled eventually.
But the satellite wasn't destroyed, was it?
No,
Okay.
no. Eventually,
It was just dazzled, as you said?
I'm sorry.
It was dazzled?
Yes, the sensor itself was dazzled. We had a real-time readout of the sensor. In fact, we flew it out of a place called the Bat Cave in Alexandria, Old Town Alexandria. It's a building, just nondescript, two-story building, run by the Naval Research Laboratory. That's where they operated Clementine from. Clementine was also an SDI mission around the moon, mapping the moon. After Clementine was through, we just used that facility and the same ground crew largely. So we had a real-time readout from the sensor. So when the laser hit it, we could see the scene just go. And of course, recorded all the data and gave it to the physicist. And eventually, Misty died. It just ran out of fuel, ran out of life before it could be deorbited. So it's still up there. And in fact, the shuttle had to maneuver once to get out of the way, because it was right about that same altitude, co-altitude, just a good experimental altitude.
Question.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse my lack of knowledge in world history, but that's Misty 3 was in Russia, or it was made by Russia?
I'm sorry?
Was it made by Russia?
No, we made it.
Okay.
Yeah,
So who was Boris?
Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia who complained about the test.
So
Because,
why did he complain?
because they viewed it as an ASAT test, as an active test of an anti-satellite capability, which is outlawed under the ABM treaty.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to characterize it and phrase it correctly as a sensor experiment, and we were allowed to do that. Another interesting satellite was MSX, Mid-Course Space Experiment. That was a big honker. It wouldn't even fit in this room. It had a huge cryo tank for infrared sensing. Had 21 different sensors on board. It was built by Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab in Maryland. What's the name of that town in Maryland?
College Point?
No, it's
No.
it's halfway between DC and Baltimore.
Laurel? Laurel.
No,
It's near there. We were there a couple weeks ago.
With a G?
well, I'm sorry, I'm just drawing a blank. Anyway, APL is very, very famous for building satellites. Even though it's part of Johns Hopkins, but it has a huge, long history of building satellites for DoD. In fact, they built the original transit satellites for navigation purposes. They're a great place to do satellite work. And then we went to Goddard, which was right down the road, for all our thermal vac and testing, and that's where our ground control station was. But and I was in charge of the ground segment for that, so the mission planning and mission execution, and it was just incredible to schedule 21 different sensors for each day's worth of experimentating. The command upload for this, was just ginormous to coordinate all these sensors, because they were looking up and down and left and right and all different UV, vis, IR, you name it. There was, we got into a bit of a brouhaha because it was several thousand kilometer altitude. And we wanted to not only do a background survey to see what the natural ambient environment looked like, but we also wanted to see how well can we pick out targets against the Earth. And also, as long as we're up here, we can survey the geo belt. And there were some classified organizations that did not like the idea of this DoD satellite just inspecting other satellites and taking pictures, namely the National Reconnaissance Office, because at the time they were still very black. You couldn't even say those words back then. And they literally wanted all of the data takes every day to go through them so they could screen and make sure that we weren't looking at any one of their satellites before they would give us the data. And we said, no. So we worked out a protocol where, we won't look at certain places, certain pieces of the sky at certain times. You tell us where not to look when maybe there's something there, maybe there's not, but we worked around it. And after its cryo was depleted, it continued for a number of years just doing sky ambient surveys as well as surveying the geobelt, just good data gathering. So anyway, I talked about the lasing MISTY 3. That was a lot of fun. That was quite a joint venture because SDIO or BMDO at the time owned the satellite and was flying it. The Miracle laser belongs to the Army and really was designed as an anti-satellite weapon. There's no doubt about it. You don't build a laser that big and point it up if you don't want to kill satellites. It has since found a more applicable life. They use it now. It has led to the development of other lasers to shoot down rockets, like Katyusha rockets that people like to throw at Israel. The beam director is very fast, and it can pick up Katyusha, which is like a big bazooka, slew and shoot it in mid-flight, and it has been demonstrated a number of times. Then the intent then was to build mobile high-energy lasers that are basically 2 semi-tractor trailer load sizes and put them around the battlefield. So if somebody's shooting Scuds at you or Katyushas, you can shoot them down with a laser instead of with a THAAD missile or a Patriot missile. So that's been proven to work. And Miracle is still out there and doing good stuff. Let's see. So anyway, that was while I was in the Air Force. I retired from the Pentagon from the SDIO BMDO office. It got to be not so much fun when everything went to being ground-based for the space cadets. In fact, the space experiments got really cut back. Everything went to funding the ground-based missiles and their corresponding radars. But like most retired military in the Washington, D.C. area, I went to work as a Beltway bandit. There are a number of companies, there's just a partial list, that provide CETA support to the government, DoD, the services, the intel community, because the government only has a finite number of people, and they need specific technical support. So they rely on these companies to do that. I know, Mike, you're familiar with the way things work there. That's been that way for ages, will be. That's the primary means that the government gets specific technical support. And it's not all just small companies. Lockheed Martin does it, Northrop Grumman does it, but things like Answer, GRC, SAIC, Command, Booz Allen, that's a major part of their business.
Does Johns Hopkins APL get categorized under setup, or is it something else?
Yes, they can be contracted for that as well.
Okay.
So my first assignment was with the DoD Space Architect. Back in the mid-90s, and still to this day, the services all have their own individual space programs. And the DoD Space Architect was formed to do an overarching look across space missions and figure out who should be doing what in longer term, as opposed to Air Force says, I want to do this, and Navy says, I want to do that, etc. So we did a number of architecture studies that then flowed into the Secretary of Defense and said, you should do these kinds of programs to do this kind of stuff for 10, 15 years out from now. The first one was MIL-SATCOM, because there's MIL-SATCOM is a huge, varied mishmash of programs, satellites, frequencies, missions, capabilities. I could go on for an hour just talking about the MilSatCom architecture. And again, each service has its own desires and wants. You know, Discus is a good example where the Air Force flies the Discus satellite, which is primarily X-band, but the Army controls the payload because they're the primary user of that capability. The Navy flies UFOs, UHF follow-ons, and fleet SATCOM satellite constellations because that's UHF, you think push-to-talk, tactical radio, and they are the primary user of that capability. They don't have a lot of big X-band dishes in the Navy except on very big ships, on aircraft carriers. So there's all sorts of different things going on. So we took it was a year-long study, and one of the conclusions was if you look at all of the capabilities and missions that need to be supported and plot those capabilities out over time, they go like this. And if you look at the resources we're going to have up there, that line goes like this. So there are gaps in capabilities in the future. And that led to the Pentagon saying we need to initiate a new satellite program called Wideband Gap Filler. It was to fill the gap in a specific capability. It also led to the conclusion that is still very much true today, that DoD will rely on commercial SATCOM to fill those gaps forever. DoD leases a ton of commercial satellite communications. Always has, always will. There's no way the military is going to put up enough communications capability to meet its needs. That is managed by the Defense Information Security Agency, DISA, inside the Beltway. And that's contracted with various providers, Hughes, Iridium, Global Star, whomever. They just go out and buy capability, like when we go into the Middle East, when we go into Iran or Afghanistan. There's a huge need for satellite communications bandwidth. We don't have military birds there, so we lease it off of the commercial satellite providers. That's a huge ongoing contractual arrangement. Spend a lot of money on that.
Quick question, is the Miracle satellite still active right now?
I'm sorry?
The Miracle?
Miracle is the laser on the ground at White Sands, New Mexico. Yes. It's still a test facility. It's the biggest laser we've got. The Russians and Chinese both have similar facilities. So the next architecture study was space control. And that is a very pejorative term because it implies you're going to do things to deny the use of space by somebody else. Yes, that's what it's all about. That was a very, very highly classified study, but we looked at it from three perspectives. One was a surveillance or awareness. We need to know what's going on up there, who's doing what the capabilities are. We need to protect our own stuff, and we need to deny the adversary's use of their stuff if we so decide. So that was a very interesting year-long piece of work as well. And then the final one I was involved with was mission ground segment. Every constellation or every satellite up there has some ground control station. And if you are interested in denying the use of that satellite, probably the softest target, the easiest way to take it out is to take out the ground control segment, cut the power. You know, there's these big dishes out there, blow up a dish. It's a lot easier to do that than to necessarily go after the satellite. So we surveyed all of the ground control stations and functions and capabilities across DoD, NASA, NOAA, to see if, okay, if this site goes down, who else can pick up that load? How can we cross-strap, if you will, between DoD, these other agencies, and the intel community in case we lose a certain site? Who else can talk to this bird and still take care of the command and data handling and tasking and everything else? So there is a way to cross-strap across different ground control segments. We also looked at the commercial sector's vulnerability as well, because we were, as we realized how reliant we are on commercial SATCOM, we worried about the commercial ground stations as well. And of course, entered into discussions with them about, we'd really like it if you hardened your facilities a little bit more. And in fact, DoD is only supposed to lease capability from a commercial satellite if that satellite has the ability to encrypt its command and data handling, to just an extra layer of security to avoid somebody hijacking or taking over the transponder or reading our traffic. The traffic, of course, is encrypted, but we also like the command and data handling to be encrypted, which is sort of contrary to the commercial model. They don't feel the need to encrypt their command and data handling for their own purposes, but yet we want them to have that box on board with NSA approved encryption. So, okay, we'll put the box on, but we don't really want to turn it on. If we're not going to use it, we don't want to turn on a box on a satellite if we don't have to. And anything we can do to keep things simpler, we like to keep it that way. So there's this ongoing yin and yang about, we'd like you to do this, but yeah, I know you want me to do it, but I don't want to do it. So what are you going to do? Pay me to do it.
Can I ask a question about that? It seems to be that if I was launching a $1 billion commercial satellite, and I have the command and control of that satellite being open clear text, it would expose me to a severe case of blackmail. Somebody could just hack my satellite and deny me access to it.
Yes, but you don't necessarily have to have NSA type security, which the military requires you have level 1 or level 2 type encryption. And transponders have been hijacked. There's a case over at the Indian Ocean where somebody just hijacked a transponder. I think it was a RAB satellite, and I think it was involved the Tamir rebels, but they were just broadcasting whatever they wanted in the region, and the satellite owners and operators had no idea. This went on for months, and the people that owned and flew the satellite didn't know that this transponder was being used for this purpose, until finally somebody complained and said, where the hell is this coming from? And they said, no, it can't be us. And finally they looked and said, yes, somebody just took over a transponder, and they're just doing whatever they wanted with it. They're just using it to relay their own broadcasts. So it has been done. Let's see. So another thing that happened around that same time was war games got involved with space. The two premier war colleges are the Army War College in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, and the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. That's where you send colonels and captains to learn how to be better generals when they grow up, and make them good generals and admirals. That's been going on forever. Well, in 1997, one of the players on the red team, war games are, the bad guys are the red team, the good guys are the blue team, and there's this scenario that's concocted, and they play this war game. Well, the red team was just getting their butts kicked at the end of the game, which usually happens. You know, it's always nice when the blue guys win. So a space savvy guy on the red team is like the last move of the game. Took a bunch of ICBMs and just lofted them into the GPS orbits and set off nukes and just destroyed the whole GPS constellation because they were losing so bad on the ground. They figured, well, if at least we deny the blue guy's GPS, we'll stand a better chance. And there was this hue and cry of, you can't do that.
Hell yeah, you'd be so sneaky.
Hell yes, I can. You know, you put me up, backed me into a corner, so I took out your GPS constellation. And that was really this call to people to realize that, wow, the stuff we have in space really does have an impact on the terrestrial combat. Because what would we do without GPS? And it doesn't take that many nukes to take out the whole constellation. So that started the space community getting more and more involved with these war games. And what we did, especially from the NRO standpoint, we created a fake constellation. We did not bring to the table the real constellation and capabilities, but something dumbed down, yet still substantial, and started playing those in the games so the operators could see what the value of the space assets was giving them in terms of intelligence and, you know, photos and reconnaissance and communications. And then as time went on, the Air Force finally got involved. They don't have the same war college structure per se, but they started a series of space games that were really more directly involved with space combat, shooting down satellites, disrupting satellites to evaluate the impact on the terrestrial battle. And of course, the results, you know, were all classified, but they were very enlightening. And now there's a whole sort of generation of senior officers that understand what's going on and how space plays in that game. I remember I was on the game floor. I was what's called an assessor, or the judge. Is the way a game works is, so there's a scenario. The red guys say, this is what we're going to do, and the blue guys say, this is what we're going to do independently. And they tell it to the judges, and then overnight the judges say, okay, if they actually did this, this is what tomorrow would look like. And then the players say, okay, now we'll take our next move. So I knew a move from the red team was going to be to take out a couple of reconnaissance satellites. So I was on the game floor next to this Navy admiral, and they're doing their stuff, and all of a sudden they start losing this link, and now we're not getting this imagery, now we're not getting this communications. And they had no idea, you know, it never crossed their mind that somebody would actively go after the satellite. And they just, okay, now what do we do when we don't have the imagery we were counting on? You know, we can't send this strike force out. So how do we work around it?
Approximately what year was that this lack of knowledge was?
This was 95 to 97, 99. So I've been out of the war game business since then, but it did open a lot of eyes. Yes, sir.
So this is going to sound a little bit stupid because it's about the movie War Games,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't know if you've seen it or not. But in the movie, they use supercomputers to simulate all the different scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
And that would have been back in the 80s. So I'm wondering if that continued, but this was a separate experiment, or like what's the relationship between having two teams making active decisions versus having everything be sort of a theoretic game-based simulation?
These games are not computer-based.
Right.
So people do those studies and analyses and run those simulations and scenarios. But in these games, it's people saying, I want to do this thing tomorrow and I want to do it this way. And then in order to keep things moving quickly, it's a very qualitative analysis by the judges overnight, because to run that whole scenario in great finite detail is just too much to do day by day, because these are big scenarios covering a huge theater of operations. And you got everything from tanks and trucks to satellites to ships and airplanes. And
so is your job as a judge in that situation to take two different strategies or plays and determine the outcome?
yes.
Okay.
And again, it's more qualitative than quantitative, but it's based on, okay, if the red guy says, I want to execute this action at this time against this target, which, okay, first, is that feasible? You know, can this guy see that target at that time? What is the probability that that action is going to be successful? You know, sometimes you hit, sometimes you miss. So we combine all of those things and factor them into the secondary impacts as well. So when the players come back the next morning, they've got a different, you know, map of what happened. You know, well, you lost 3 ships, you lost 27 airplanes. You know, now what are you going to do? And the other aspect of these games is, well, you try different tactics, and you use different capabilities that may not necessarily be in existence at the time, as a way to see how would somebody use this if it existed. The Navy, for example, was very interested in, instead of having all these big aircraft carriers, what if we just have little boats with limited firepower but dozens of them? You know, how would we use that in a scenario? Another favorite for a while was what we called the rods from God. Depleted uranium rods put in orbit, about 5 meters long, about that big around, with a little bit of guidance package on the back, that could be deorbited and just come screaming in. Like Mach 25, depleted uranium rod hitting the ground makes a very large hole. And these things postulated were just, we had them in orbit, and if we saw, the blue guys saw a concentration of bad guys' tanks over there, they could just deorbit these rods into that area, and the effects were just catastrophic. So that was like, wow, this could be a very useful weapon. We never made them or anything, you know, it was a thought experiment sort of. But if you want, you can do kinetic kill from space if you can get those things up there and get them deorbited accurately and in a timely fashion. So those were the kinds of thought and physical experimentation that went on. And then also for the commanders, if you had this capability, how would you use it, and how would you act differently with different capabilities? So that's basically the basis of what goes on in space games. Let's see, a little bit on program management. You know, how do you get money out of the Pentagon? It's difficult. First, you have to realize they're on a 5-year budgeting process, but they're only authorized for 1 year. And money is always hard to come by. Now in the space arena, each service has its own structure that's roughly similar. You have product divisions that are responsible for buying and procuring items. You know, you have a product center for satellites, a product center for launch vehicles, a product center for airplanes, a product center for tanks. And then in that food chain, you will also have research laboratories that support development of those kinds of products. And then So each service has that similar structure. The Air Force in particular is centered around Los Angeles and Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. But the Army also has an Army Space Command in Colorado Springs. They have a Space and Missile Defense Command headquartered in Huntsville, Alabama, that does a lot of space work. And another thing to be aware of is there's different colors of money, 6-1, 6-2, 6-3, 6-4. When money is authorized and appropriated, it comes as one of these categories. 6-1 is basic research. 6-2 is applied research. 6-3 is development. 6-4 is production. So if you're buying a satellite, it's with 6-4 money. If you are doing basic research on materials for thermal control in a laboratory setting, that would be 6-1 money. If you want to maybe build a structure out of that and shake and bake it, that would probably be 6-2 money. If you want to do an experiment, a test, that would be 6-3 money. So it's not something, well, it's something to be aware of, but it's what the govies keep track of. They can only spend money depending on its color on the appropriate level of effort, if you will, or level of physics. Two other things you're probably familiar with: TRLs, technology readiness levels. Those play a very big factor. If something, TRLs go from 1 to 9. 9 is fully tested, operational. TRL 1 is maybe 1 view graph deep. So things don't really get to the point of serious consideration until they're at TRL 6. And I don't recall, I could look it up, the specific definitions of what each technology readiness level is, but that's another overlay in terms of, you know, we want to fund this, or we're interested in doing this. Most startup kinds of things, you're not at a TRL 1 because that's basic science, that's, you know, academic research kind of thing. But TRL, you need to be around a TRL 6, which would be a proof of concept or ready for a demonstration. And the higher up the TRL chain, the better. Another great way to get startup funding is through the SBIR program. All of DoD has SBIR funding every year. It's around, awards are like up to a year, around 150K. Then you can go from level 1 SBIR to 2 and 3. Those are announced like all other funding opportunities in Commerce Business Daily. DoD and the Intel community has to publicly announce that. So that's a great way to get money, because it's, you know, yeah, I think you've got a good idea. Here's 50K, here's 100K. You know, pursue it for 6 months and come back and tell us. Very little supervision. It can really help keep the lights on when you're trying to get started. Let me see it. The other thing, laboratories, and I'll talk about my particular experience at Wright-Patterson. The materials laboratory does a lot of space research. They do some of it in-house, but a lot of it is contracted out. Some of it goes to like Lockheed Martin, you know, building a solar array that will stand up to laser attack. Some of it is just come up with a new material that's better insulation. Come up with a new thermal control subsystem. So the labs themselves contract out a lot of research. And the materials lab at Wright-Patt does a lot of space work, but the Space Vehicles Directorate at Kirtland Air Force Base is really the center for space research for the Air Force. NRL is very, very well known for space systems research. They're in Washington, D.C. on Bowling Air Force Base, and then SMDC in Huntsville, Alabama also does research. So those are the three places to be aware of as sources of money. So a couple of business development stories. So when I was working at TASC, TASC is a CETA, and in particular, they service the National Reconnaissance Office and the CIA with technical support staff. Since we were in the space business, we knew all of our capabilities, all the classified good stuff. We knew what the commercial world was capable of doing. We knew what the Russians did, how they built their satellites. We knew how the Chinese did theirs. So we knew everything about everything that was flying in space in a classified sense. So what a couple of us tried to get TASC interested in was thinking about the venture cap community. When somebody is asking, this was back in the day when there were a lot of commercial communications satellite programs being launched or thought about. There's the 800 ball constellation out of Seattle. There's Global Star, Iridium had just launched, but everybody was looking for money. And as an example, this with Global Star, I alluded to earlier, as I'm reading in half week, you're going to go 1,400 clicks. You're crazy, you'll die. And at the time, they said they were going to cross-link all of their satellites by laser comm. Oh, really? Do you know nobody's really ever flown that yet? This was back in the late 90s. It still really isn't that proven in a commercial sense. So who in their right mind is going to give these guys money? Because they just have these technical flaws. Another example is if you want deployable antennas on orbit, big mesh deployable antennas, at that point, at that time, there was only one company in the country to get them from, because they made them for the Intel community. So if you weren't going there, you weren't getting the good stuff. So we knew all those kinds of things, and the thought was we could advise the venture cap people that this sounds a little flaky. Maybe you don't want to loan them money. Maybe you want to have different payback terms. Maybe you want to jack up your interest rate. Maybe you don't want to take partial ownership in something. But Global Star got funded. In fact, right around that time, I happened to meet a banker from some bank, I forget what, but who had contributed $200 million towards Global Star funding to get it off the ground. And I said, where did you get your technical advice from? Because there's these two major flaws in their approach. And he said, it was Bernie Schwartz talking to us. We figured he knew what he was talking about. I'm like, what? No, he just pulled the wool over your eyes. So I still do not know or do not understand where the venture cap community gets technical sanity checks on things they are asked to fund. We tried to get TASC to try and fill that gap because we could talk in an unclassified fashion about, no, that's not feasible, that's not doable. But TASC just didn't want to do it. It was out of their comfort zone. We like doing what we do, which is CETA support, providing engineers to this community and that community. We're just not interested in expanding into this line of business. So to me, at least in my reading and keeping up with things, that still seems to be a major gap. Another one, when I was at BAE Systems, BAE is a global company. It's like the fifth, or second or third largest defense contractor in the world, because it's headquartered in the UK. So when you include all of that, they're enormous. The North America group operates separately, so they can have DoD contracts. We noticed that, well, the Army was interested in what can you do with small satellites, because the Army wanted to get more control over their own assets in space. And in particular, we noticed that there is an increasing demand for UHF satellite communications. There was more demand than capability at the time, and as the existing constellation was being flown out and replaced by a new constellation, in fact, the UHF tactical capability was decreasing. So we came up with an idea of how about if you just take a 3-ball constellation, small satellites, small enough that you launch 3 of them on a Minotaur 1, which is a Minuteman first stage and a Orbital Sciences second stage. And if there is a hotspot, say we had to go into an action in Argentina, and we don't have satellite communications coverage over Argentina, well, you launch a 3-ball and run 10,000, I think it's 10,000 kilometers. A 3-ball can give you constant coverage. As one is going over the horizon, another one's coming up. So you could fill that gap and provide UHF capability in a region on a short notice. And then if things kept going bad, launch another 3 and populate the constellation. But you could tailor the coverage because you'd launch out of Vandenberg to basically any place you needed to cover. Pick the orbit, pick the parameters, launch into it, and on relatively short notice have, in this case, UHF communications capability. Or now it's not so much of interest, they could be imagery satellites. But now there's enough commercial imagery out there that probably would not be that big of a sell. But for the Army, they were very interested in this. But the leadership at BAE, again, that was outside of their comfort zone. That that's not something we do, and we just don't want to go there, which was very unfortunate because the Army asked us specifically, give us white papers, give us proposals on how you would do this. But we never got the company leadership behind it. BAE Systems does make components for satellites, electronic components, but they just, taking this was just a step too far for them. And was even stranger at the time, they had just entered into an agreement with Surrey Satellites. So they had a working relationship with Surrey, which could make the small sats. A UHF comm payload is about as simple as it gets, but it was just, no, that's not in our line of business. We don't want to go there at this point.
Well, didn't the bankruptcy of Iridium give the Army an opportunity to pick up on the cheap, like 10 cents or 5 cents on the dollar, an entire satellite system with handsets and so forth?
Yes, they do use it, but that's very low data rate.
Mm-hmm.
They are competing with all the rest of the Iridium users. In fact, DoD has a standing contract with Iridium for service. They renew it every year, and they have a dedicated ground station in Hawaii that all the DoD traffic goes through to get to Iridium. So they filled that gap to a certain extent. But now you've got a regular Iridium handset doesn't necessarily work good in a battlefield, and sand and snow and jungle and everything else. The military has thousands of UHF communications, ground equipment, thousands that are already there. And they're painted green and meet all the mil specs and everything. But there's just not enough bandwidth on orbit to be able to use them. So yeah, you can use your Iridium, and they have militarized it to a certain extent. But that's a bad workaround from the standpoint of you've got tactics and techniques and procedures of how to use UHF comms. You train using it, and to switch over to something else as a stopgap doesn't necessarily work that well. I know there's lots of stories where, okay, a soldier in the battlefield has his cell phone, and that comes in handy, but you don't want to plan a large-scale operation where, okay, everybody make sure you have your cell phones with you. And Iridium is what 2.4 kilobit data rate. It's very low data rates. So there are limitations, but they are using it because they can't provide it for themselves. So anyway, we thought we had a valid gap-filling solution there, but again, in both of these cases, we couldn't get the corporate buy-in to move forward. So I think those are my war stories, if you will, for now. I think, for this group, given its startup nature, I see these two things as voids that could still be filled. In particular, the common sense evaluation of what works, what won't. And it is rocket science, but it's very well documented rocket science. We've both got everything you need to know is in this book, honestly. And I've got various cheat sheets where, if you want a 3-ball constellation, what altitude do you have to put it at in order to get coverage? What kind of orbit do you want to use? There are a whole host of different orbits. There's geo orbits, there's LEO orbits, there's sun sync, there's mollies, there's inclined. Different satellites use different orbits for different purposes, and you want to make sure that your orbit and your constellation matches your mission and your need. Another interesting thing about satellite radio, back when XM and Sirius were both deploying, the first one, I forget which one was first, put their satellites in GEO, which is a very expensive proposition. But launching the GEO cost a lot of money. And the second company announced they had discovered this miraculous secret or new orbit that had been previously unknown, called the Molniya orbit, that basically has a lot of hang time in the northern hemisphere and then whips around the South Pole. So in a 12-hour period, you spend 11 hours roughly over the northern hemisphere. It's a lot easier launch-wise and cost-wise to launch into a Molniya orbit. Great money saving. So they were saying, wow, we just discovered this. And that was an undergraduate homework problem. Determine what this orbit is. Inclination is 63.2 degrees. I forget the exact number, but it's been around forever. The Russians have been using that for their communication satellites since the dawn of launching, because they have so much territory in the northern latitudes that you can't see very well from GEO. So it's hard to get satellite communications above 70 degrees north. They've got a lot of landmass up there, so they put their communication satellites into mollies. Been doing it for years, so it was just sort of humorous that oh, you just discovered this? It's been around for 50 years. But it's worked well for them. So there's like I say, it's rocket science, but it can be pretty straightforward. And what I carry around a lot of what I call cheat sheets, just how to explain to people what a ground track is, what orbital coverage is, different types of orbits, what they're good for, how they precess, how you can avoid precession if you want sun sync for weather or imagery. Here's how you go about doing it. Constraints on launching. For example, from the Cape, you can only launch to in a certain range of inclinations because of the constraints that you can't overfly land. Because if something blows up, you don't want to be killing people, so you want it over the water. So if you want to launch in anything outside those inclinations, you've got to go someplace else. It's usually Placettes or Vandenberg in the U.S. or now Sea Launch. But they're just very simple aspects that are not always understood by people making $100 million kind of decisions. So that's what I think a group like this can offer in terms of a sanity check. I know nothing about the financial world or the financial business cases and that kind of stuff, but I can tell you, no, you don't want to go in that orbit. And if you're thinking about doing it this way, you can have thermal control problems. So, you need this kind of guy on your team, and you need to examine this, etc.
Yeah, we're starting to build a list of consultants that can help with that. We have Blaze Sanders, who worked at NASA and started some companies, and I think he's working for Tesla now, but he's like an electrical engineer who's done some space stuff, and he's kind of helping us out as we're starting up. But yeah, we need to kind of build that out a little more. We talked to Space Angels about how they do it too, and they said they just do it in-house. Not sure how in-depth they go with their due diligence with the science part of things, but I think most of it is done kind of like a couple meetings and then sign a check.
Yeah. But it seems to me it's more like an actuarial table approach. For example, when xenon ion propulsion or Hall effect thrusters were being proposed for next generation and electric satellites, somebody had to figure out, okay, how much we're going to charge for insurance on this bird. But without having a lot of data on have these things flown before and how well have they worked, basically you've got to ask Boeing, who's going to put it on their 702, and Boeing's going to tell you, oh, it's going to work great, don't worry about it. As long as you're going back to the source to get your information about how well their stuff works. That seems to me to be a little like a self-licking ice cream cone.
So aside from the assurance aspect that you spoke about, how much permission would you need beforehand? Because I know you mentioned that the Russians have like a huge territory in space. I was wondering if someone launches a satellite in their region, would it be shot down?
Well, it depends what satellite you're launching and what you're going to do with it. Basically, the communications satellite arena is very well regulated by the ITU. You have to apply for frequencies, you have to apply for slots, you have to prove there's going to be no interference to anybody else. And now if you're just talking about, say, a reconnaissance satellite, no, that's not a good example. Say an imagery satellite, like, Black Sky Global is looking to put up numerous small imagery satellites so they can have basically provide imagery on demand. You have to, and I forget the organization, you have to go through and make sure that you're not going to interfere with somebody else's orbit. Now, the Air Force does a lot of work in conjunction analyses, keeping track of everything out there and providing warnings that somebody's going to get too close. That doesn't always work, as the Iridium and the Russian ComSat had their collision a few years ago. Of course, the Chinese did an ASAT test. They shot down one of their own satellites, just contributed a huge debris field. They just said, oops, we don't care, we don't have to. So it's not a strict protocol or regimen. If you want to launch something and you're going to interfere with somebody else, you will receive pressure from them to not interfere. But I don't know of any way they can stop you, per se. Now, you have to get a license to launch, obviously. But the FAA, yeah, I guess it's the FAA that, no. Who is it that does the space launch approvals?
Khaki would know.
Yeah, it's a government agency that will do some due diligence to make sure that there's not interference. But it's usually more of a gentle person's agreement amongst operators that, you know, I'm not going to put something up that's going to interfere with you. And you also have your own incentive to make sure of that, because if you're interfering with somebody else, they're interfering with you. So you want to make sure you're going into an orbit. You can query NASA for all the element sets. You can query the Air Force for the element sets. You can use STK and do you know, first order analysis. But the area that is highly regulated is communications. And in fact, with the advent of all these low Earth orbit systems, Iridium, Globalstar, they had to demonstrate that they would not interfere with communications from somebody at GEO to the ground. And you basically, you can do that rather easily by just using different frequencies, because you're not competing for the same transponder frequency allocation. But if you do, you've got to go through the ITU. And if somebody thinks you're going to interfere with them, they can file with the ITU and stop you.
Office of Space Transportation, Office Commercial Space Transportation, I think is the licensing body.
Are they part of the FAA or?
They're under, yes, under FAA.gov.
Okay. I knew it was somebody in the FAA. I couldn't remember exactly who. But that's a very new office. And they're also in charge of licensing things like Virgin Galactic. So they've got a long ways to go. I mean, they've got a lot to do and a long ways to go. And I don't know what their staffing is, but you know, I also don't know who their CETA is. They've got to, the govies make the decisions, and there are some technical government personnel, but in the large, the technical expertise is contracted for. As Mike and I made our living doing that for a while. Anyway, so that is the extent of my prepared remarks. Make sure I didn't leave out any good war story stuff here. Like I say, it's rocket science, but it's definitely documented science, and things like these cheat sheets. I found myself, especially with BAE, doing a lot of teaching about just how the space segment works, because the the engineers at BAE were all about communications. They could make radios. And just don't take a radio and put it on a satellite. They didn't realize there's like time delay between here and geo and back. That can really screw up internet protocol transmissions unless you code accordingly. So there's a lot of just basic information that needs to be considered when you are structuring a mission and an architecture and a design. And there are plenty of needs out there. Another example is with Black Sky Global, for example. They're going to put up a lot of imagery satellites. They got to get all that data down. That's a lot of data. And if they want to have government involvement as well, they will probably need to do some encryption of their imagery data. Those are big data streams, and trying to do onboard encryption takes a lot of horsepower, and you have to go through the National Security Agency. They're the gatekeepers for encryption, and it has been an uphill battle for everyone trying to get approved imagery encryption on board a satellite, and it's a big price tag. Now, if you're just going to go purely for the commercial market, you don't have to worry about it. But there's a lot of money to be had in servicing the government as well.
Their satellites are not using CubeSats, they're going to be using some sort of small sats.
Yeah.
So that not only does it consume power, the encryption, but also consumes space on the satellite, which is at a premium if you're a small sat. How would a Black Sky Global compete with Skybox? It's another imaging constellation.
Just from what I've been able to discover just on the web, it's just a matter of coverage. If we put up enough satellites, we've got coverage, and you can, put in your order and get a result back within a couple of hours.
Well, that's the Skybox model as well, I believe, and Google's funding Skybox. I would say that probably there's more money behind Skybox than there is behind Black Sky.
What does Planet Labs do?
I'm sorry?
What does Planet Labs do? How big is it?
Well, they're launching telescopes. I believe it's for
CubeSats.
CubeSats for ground pictures.
Yeah.
I don't know how they get the data.
Well, they
But they got multiple, was it 20, 30 at a time or something? There's like 16 of them.
There's a constellation.
do storing forward. In other words, they take the pictures, store the pictures on the flash, and then when they get over the downlink site, then they can download.
Yeah, just don't.
So they don't relay.
No, they're satellites. They're not even powered really. I mean, they don't have any
No
propulsion. They're just out there as like boxes that fall to the ground after a while.
All CubeSats have that problem. Yeah.
So I guess like a lot of people here are actually more familiar with Skybox and Planet Labs than they are with Black Sky Global. Or maybe I'm just thinking of myself, but I think from an entrepreneurship standpoint, like people think of those as new space startup companies. So what I'd be curious to know is more about what is Black Sky Global's business model. What do they do? What do they provide?
All I have uncovered is just from their website. I was intrigued because the chief technical officer, the president, is used to run the Air Force's responsive space program out of Kirtland, which was to build small satellites and get them up quickly. So I saw his name, and their tagline is imagery on demand. Other than that, it's a very sparse description of just how they're doing it. They've got, I guess their major funding comes from, somebody, a failed communications private venture.
Well, and they're frequently asked questions. They say has raised a total of 28.5 million over the past 2 years. A portion which has gone toward funding Black Sky Global. Black Sky Global is fully funded to deploy 6 spacecraft by the end of 2016. They're like a non-competitor to larger organizations like Skybox. I mean, 6 satellites is not even a portion of a tiny portion of this constellation is being planned by Skybox.
They're late in the game.
Yeah, and they're late and they're underfunded. So, I mean,
Yeah, a lot of their funding comes from Something Ventures, their parent company. Jason Andrews. He tried to do something else that fell through. So now he's funding Black Sky Global. But, so people are trying,
yeah.
but I don't know what the details are. I presume it's in, visible imagery.
Well, a lot of them are actually getting out of visible and into radar, infrared. I mean, we had a company here that was speaking about getting nighttime coverage, cloud coverage, whereas current capabilities are just daytime, clear sky.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things he mentioned was a demand for image encryption. So is that demand from the company side or is that from the government side?
From the government side.
From the government side.
Yeah. So if they want you to look at a certain site, and they want, like, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency buys a lot of commercial satellite imagery to supplement the government reconnaissance capabilities. So if they're going to say, we want you to be looking at a certain location, we only want us to be able to, only give the picture to us, they're going to
They
demand.
want it to stay private. But is there a clear reason why image encryption is different from data encryption in general?
Just volume.
There's ways to
Just
speed it
scope.
up.
Yeah, it's just that the imagery is a lot of data. And if you're trying to do real-time downlink, then it's a problem of computing speed and power. That's it.
And I think part of the architecture that you were describing earlier is that all contractors with the military has to be encrypted up and down, but then you were also saying it has to be encrypted actually in the box, in the satellite. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
For communications or imagery.
Just for computer processes inside the...
If it's imagery, they want it encrypted before it's downlinked.
Okay.
As well as they want, if I'm going to lease capability on that bird from Hughes, I want Hughes to ensure that that command data stream is also encrypted. So nobody can hijack and listen into my traffic, even though the traffic is encrypted. So the government always encrypts their own traffic. But the imagery, NSA back some years ago was trying to develop with industry a chip to do the onboard imagery encryption. And I've just lost track of where that went, but there is obviously a commercial push for it. So I'm sure they've gotten to something because NGA is buying commercial imagery from, anyway, film company in Colorado. I forget their name now too.
the price of the launching and satellites construction is rapidly going down. Can you think of any projects that were shelved because of the high costs, but had nevertheless were a borderline business case with high satellite launch costs and satellite prices?
Then that didn't make the cut because of construction costs and launch costs.
Mm-hmm.
NPOS.
NPOS is a good example. That was a joint DoD NOAA weather program. They tried to do too much. What was the big DoD SATCOM thing that failed? There's another deal.
Yeah.
I know, it's, I
Sorry.
think
First, initials of D.
it starts with a T.
D is David.
Oh, TSAT, Transformational Satellite Communications, died under its own weight, but that was a DoD program.
Any commercial
And the
program?
I'm racking my brain trying to think of back in the late 90s, there were so many,
Well, what made
So
the
many-
original law? That was part of it, wasn't it? The high expenses of launching that.
I'm sorry?
What ate original law, the high expenses, in general, they just couldn't make enough money.
No, it was a failed business model because they planned to have communications anywhere. And I love their commercials, their, full page ads in Time magazine, showed the Himalayas. They'd say, you can use our phone here. What I liked about those advertisements was that they showed no customers. So that was actually a big problem for Iridium. There was no customers for their technology.
But there were, back in the day, a whole host of things that were going to go up, and I don't have that cheat sheet with me. But like the 800 ball communications constellation, that was, I forget its name, that was Craig.
The cell phone person?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. But those are played out. I think everybody understands communications. And
Mhm.
those are, was there some new thing, some out of the box thinking? I understand weather satellites are pretty, those are well-worn
Mhm.
tracks for satellite. Is there anything that you might remember that was unusual?
I think there may have been an early attempt to do a SAR imagery satellite on a commercial basis that never got off the ground because I think that was not launch related, but just the complexity of synthetic aperture radar just drove the price tag up.
What did they expect to be able to offer customers based on their SAR imagery? What was the advantage of SAR over optical imagery for their customers?
Nighttime,
Just nighttime.
nighttime primarily.
You can go through the clouds and stuff.
Yeah.
The company
Yeah.
that Chris mentioned, Ursa Space, they were at the Space Sharks pitch night a month ago or whatever. They're using SAR for their mini set stuff, imagery.
Have they gotten any bites?
Yeah, they have they're talking to customers and they have talking to investors as well.
It's all confidential.
Yeah.
That's what they tell us.
Let's see, how do you track customers with confidential?
Smoky room
Yeah,
meetings.
it's just like getting deals, I guess. They're working with the government. I think they're always under a lot of pressure not to leak out any information.
If you're working with the government, you're competing against Northrop Grumman, you're competing against Boeing. I don't think that's a good way for a startup to work.
I think in general that's true, but do those companies you mentioned have the sort of small sat infrastructure built already? Because they're definitely a small sat company, but with like new kinds of instruments, new kinds of.
Well, when I say Boeing, I mean these are people that are going to go after the multi-billion-dollar contracts, and
But I think there's a good commercial niche for SAR and IR that can be accomplished with small satellites. Gives you the nighttime, and it also can make the ocean surveillance a little bit easier using SAR, looking for ships, vice the visible. So works around cloud cover, works at night. There's also, ships have this automatic identification system or something like that that all ships are supposed to use. They're supposed to phone home every X number of minutes with their position and speed.
Bad guys aren't going to necessarily use the.
And a lot of people just turn that off,
Right, sure.
especially if you're smuggling drugs or something. But there's growing awareness of what's called maritime domain awareness to keep track of what's going on shipping-wise. that is, that would be a combination or complementary visible SAR, IR, the AIS signals, put all that together into one picture, you get a lot of data. Especially if you're, it will work better if you limit your area of interest, obviously. If you're trying to keep track of everything, everywhere, that gets overwhelming, but like Canada has great interest in keeping track around its periphery. Australia has the same interest in around Indonesia to defend. They've got a lot of coastal border to worry about, and they're not necessarily that trusting of their northern neighbors.
How would you utilize some of that capability, imaging from SAR and IR, for a mass market commercial appeal as opposed to a government agency appeal?
I like it because it fills a niche. It overcomes the cloud cover and darkness issue. And I think once people learn how to use SAR imagery better, they can think of new things to do with it.
Right.
Now, also the multispectral and IR is great for agricultural uses, to do crop strength and crop yields and things. SAR can also get some ground penetration with that.
What that?
Just to see if something's going on that is not visible from the air. I think that would probably be power limited. So a small sat probably wouldn't have enough energy to do great ground penetration. But the shuttle flew a SAR package many years ago, looking for ancient ruins in the Middle East and the desert and stuff. They got a few meters worth of ground penetration for the package they had. Of course, they're pretty low, but they got lots of power. So could a small sat do that? That could be a challenge. And then there's also in a SAR configuration, you can separate your transmitter and receiver, which gives you more coverage options, but now you've got two buses and a complicating factor of synchronizing these two. That's not undoable, but the main thing is you've got to buy two buses now instead of one.
I think for a lot of the cases, it's not always obvious up front what the big consumer applications are going to be.
Yeah.
But the guy from Ursa, from Shark Tank, who's here with Space Sharks, he said there's a list of 600 different applications that they look at. And it's like, your marketing people aren't going to be able to satisfy all 600 of those, so they just prioritize them. And of course, they break down between government, public sector, and commercial, private. But it's all over the map. I mean, if you go to one of these companies' websites, really quickly you'll see their top 6 markets, their top 6 applications, and that might be agriculture, investing. They'll be looking at production of manufacturing plants in different countries, so you can actually, based on imagery from satellite, see whether or not they're in production or how long during the year. So that might influence commodity prices, for example, if you're an investor. That's just like one little example, but there's, to us it's hard to think about. It's not our heads, but many, many, many.
And like just the fact that now you have pictures at nighttime, it's like almost like you double your data. Like you've never had pictures at nighttime.
Right.
It's a whole new world of what's going on. Yeah.
And of course, the cloud coverage aspect just means you get 30% more just for daytime. So.
Did they mention what the resolutions were going to be?
Well, it's a good question. I think that's really a regulatory issue based on what I've heard. So it's like ITU, the organization that you have to apply for.
That's for communications.
That's for communications. But I've also heard that there's issues with, they'll also have regulations regarding resolution.
The U.S. government will put, if it's a U.S. company, the U.S. government will limit the resolution that you're allowed to go down to.
And so for U.S. companies, I believe it's a meter per pixel is the limits for the resolution.
What about their SAR resolution? What did they mention? They would be down to a meter per pixel for SAR as well?
As I heard for regular, I assume for visible.
Well, it depends on the customer.
Yeah, right, how much you want to pay. But also, I mean, technically, you can't, I don't believe they can get to 1 meter on a CubeSat.
They claim, some of the people I've talked to, like at least one of their investors said they can do they're capable of doing sub-meter per pixel. And I haven't really thought about the physics as to whether or not that's possible in the size of the satellites. But
And also part of it's software too, right? Just improving the image.
I think part of it is you have multi-view as well. You know, so it depends really what your delay period is. So it's like I want an image at this point of the Earth, and if you're willing to wait for half an hour, you might get 2 views or 3 views, in which case you can construct better resolution.
Did they talk that they were working in a 3-cube form factor? Would they talk about their form factor for their satellite at all? No? Okay.
It's just hard to know. I didn't, talk to a lot of them. A lot of it's just stuff from the website or something. It's the brush line.
Because still, to get the resolution you want, you need power, and then to be able to, so that you're not just blindly going over things, you might want to orient yourself so that it needs some sort of propulsion or ability to control their orientation, which takes fuel, which then puts them outside of a CubeSat environment. So then they become, I mean, is that mentioned at all?
Like whether they have fine-tuned control.
Yeah.
So again, this is all just speculation here, but there's this new company, relatively new company called Tachyon Propulsion. They do electric ion propulsion, which is very finely tuned kinds of micropropulsion that can get you that kind of steerage, I guess, on small satellite. And here they're in conversations with Skybox.
Yeah.
Yeah, Luigi and Kyle from Ragnarok Industries said they're talking to some Italian company that has, it's expensive. It's like $600,000 a pop, but it's I think it was 600,000, but it works. It's propulsion for CubeSats. I don't know if any have actually flown yet, but they're selling it. So.
I was going to ask about something a little different, which is, do you know if there's any concern in the government right now, NASA or the Defense Department, regarding space particles, like artificial space particles that are just kind of from decayed satellites that haven't totally burnt up?
Oh,
There's hundreds of thousands of these things, and they
absolutely.
have relative velocities that are really high, like 5-6 kilometers a second. I know there's research efforts in countries like Japan and Switzerland in particular that are very concerned and find solutions to clean up kind of stuff.
The government has guidelines to minimize debris that apply to all present future launches. But the stuff that is already up there right now that is uncatalogued is a huge concern. NORAD and the space tracking system tracks, I think, 20,000 objects, but there's tens of thousands more that are just too small to show up on radar or optical systems. And yeah, it's a big concern. There's always been, for years, some discussion of commercial endeavor to go up and start sweeping or vacuuming the space junk, space debris. You hear of ideas doing that every couple of years.
There was something recently, I saw in the news somewhere.
It was in Sweden?
Maybe, yeah.
Particularly in low Earth orbit, around the station kind of altitudes or iridium kind of altitudes. There's concern if you ever have a collision in GEO, everybody's screwed because that debris will just, when there is a debris event, it starts out localized and then it forms a shell. The orbital dynamics just will form a shell of that debris at that altitude. So if you have an event at GEO, it's just going to spread through that GEO shell and interfere with lots of satellites up there.
Well, isn't most everything at GEO going in the same direction?
Yeah, but the particles will still have delta V's.
Yeah, but they won't be in the kilometers per second. They'll be in the meters per second. Because they'll maintain whatever caused them to go away from the spacecraft to disintegrate. that's the velocity that they'll have. I'm assuming that if it's like, remember, everything in geo is moving in the same direction, right? Because they're all trying to stay on top of the same place on Earth.
Right, they're all synced with the
Right.
Earth.
So if you have some sort of bumping and then cracks the satellite, those pieces will just be drifting along with everything else.
But at a different velocity.
Slightly, yeah.
So, no, it's not going to be hypervelocity
Not at all,
impacts.
right.
But-
It'll be more like a car, high velocities.
Yeah, the huge delta V's or LEO.
Yeah, well,
It's like, concern for the ISS, for instance, it's like, what if you have like a few of these particles?
Yeah, the ISS has to maneuver frequently to avoid particles, to avoid known
Known
conjunctions.
Right.
Like the space shuttle, every time it comes back, the windshield is just pitted, from junk that nobody can track, nobody can keep track of.
it seems like there would be some opportunity. One of the things here is responsive space mission analysis and design. Was that responsive space is in the sense of like trying to launch a replacement satellite quickly as opposed to 6 years?
It's quick response.
Yeah.
I have a need, I have a mission, get me something fast and quick.
I'm going to tie this together, but in your war games, how often did the space assets get attacked?
Once we,
On each game, I mean, was it a terminal condition of every game that every?
no, within a game,
No, with a series of games. Of those series of games, 10 games, let's say, remember, did 9 of them end up in space attacks, with attacks to space assets?
I think every game I was involved with, the space assets were attacked.
So given,
Sometimes once, sometimes multiple times within a game.
so given that that's a reality for future warfare, and warfare is a constant state of human existence, and that there are aggressors like China who want to aggress, it seems to me that we should plan for a future where space will be denied to everybody because of the space junk that's in space. In other words, the hulks of these disintegrated satellites. Is there a business opportunity there, and can only Boeing access it?
In terms of just cleaning up the mess.
No, I have to reestablish GPS, or I want to reestablish Skybox. For the commercial applications, those are the things that would pay. I mean, Boeing would go after the commercial, the military market.
Mhm.
I don't think anybody here has easy inroads into that market, but we might have inroads in meeting other needs.
Well, say if GPS went away,
For example,
you could have supplemental GPS coverage. It's already been talked about in terms of high flyers or aerostats. So you could put up low altitude GPS supplemental. But to try and integrate that with the existing government-run constellation would be an issue. Just like how does GPS integrate with Galileo?
they sort of don't.
They sort of don't.
Receivers-
What they do is they say, okay, we'll put the GPS chipset in here and a Galileo chipset in there.
Correct.
But the two aren't meant to work together. Now, Japan and China have their own plans and efforts to do local GPS augmentation over their territory by satellite.
Jointly? Joint effort?
No. Just to get better coverage for their own purposes over their own land
It'd be
mass.
nice if they work together.
Work together?
What about just hardening satellites for collisions, except instead of being, is that something that's impossible?
It's not impossible. It's a matter of trade space.
Mhm.
You know, what's the in the probability business, you deal with the probability of an event and if it happens, the impact. You know, if either one of those is very low, you just sort of don't worry about it and take the risk. What happens is, what if there's a very low probability event, but it has an enormous impact? You know, then do you need to address that? That turns into a budgetary issue. The approach so far with respect to space junk and debris is hope for the best. It's a big sky. And that has worked. except for the Iridium Russian ComSat. I don't think I've heard of anybody really losing satellites on orbit from debris. There may be, degradation, but that would usually show up as a power solar cell kind of issue. And that's not something that a company like Hughes, Intelsat or somebody is going to really publicize. The commercial satellite or communications platforms are generally so oversized that they've got excess capability. I mean, at end of life, they've got 15, 20 kilowatts worth of power to feed their transponders. The LEO stuff depends upon the proliferation of capabilities. Iridium didn't go out of business just because they lost one bird. They still had 65. So that built-in redundancy helps. People generally will not go out of their way to add shielding just because it's mass. And mass bites you in launch costs.
But I think without knowing what the exact analysis is, if you were to send something into space now, what is the probability you're going to have a collision? Like that number now is probably very low.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like you mentioned yourself, like the cost of launching per kilogram is just on this downslope.
It is.
It's almost like Moore's law. And with that, you're having this, corresponding increase in small sat objects that are going into space or just launches in general. Right, so therefore, you're going to have a corresponding increase in people aren't cleaning up after themselves. You're going to have this increase in space debris. So that calculus over time is going to change. That probability is going to change.
And the feeling I have right now is that problem is being kicked down the road.
But I'm trying to imagine a situation after some near brush with World War, and then they go to the stage of blasting away all these different satellites we use for GPS. The GLONASS system is gone. The GPS is gone. I don't know. Do they go after the geostationary satellites? Are they even vulnerable because they're so far away?
You can with a big ASAT, but that takes so much time to get there.
Right.
An operator
Might move.
should be able to see it coming and move. So you need a very sophisticated ASAT that can do terminal homing, as opposed to aiming point in space. And aiming point in space, 36,000 clicks out there,
Right.
that's tough.
Right. But maybe it's not going to be a lot of space junk. Maybe it's when the adversaries go after each other's satellites,
Mhm.
they don't send out kinetic energy vehicles, do they? Because it seems a lot easier just to put a ground-based laser and laze them or microwave them.
That is generally the preferred route. However, the two ASAT engagements that have been conducted have both been kinetic. We did one and the Chinese did one.
But it seems to me that it's very expensive to send up a rocket to go after each individual satellite. If you have one laser, you can target a bunch of satellites with one device.
Absolutely.
Right. So it seems cheaper to do that. So if I was trying to get out my adversary's satellites so that I can level the playing field, that's what I would use some sort of ground-based system that's laser or microwave. So if they do that, then there's not going to be a lot of junk.
No, not from those kinds of kills.
Okay, so
if it's an electronic kill or a thermal kill,
Mhm.
like a laser against satellite, is not going to make it blow up. It's just going to overheat it.
And then it'll just be
And it dies.
a dead Hulk in space.
Yeah, then it's a big dead box.
Yeah, but otherwise it's mutually assured destruction for everybody.
Well, yeah, that's the intent. I mean, I'm assuming I'm moving ahead to the year 2041. Right? China and the United States have been tossing over these Philippines for a while now. And so when they get to the point where they're blazing each other's weapons, space satellites, and then now we have no more GPS, and we have no more GLONASS because the Russians are involved. So where's?
At least we're all the same plane level.
Exactly. But is there an economic opportunity for people like us?
That's fine. You could do a coffee or something.
I think the first conversation should be, how do we avoid?
Tomorrow, actually,
But in war, there's always gonna be some guy who's gonna profit.
you know, my phone number is on there.
Yeah.
Just give me a call. The
But
best,
space-
I'm
the
going,
opportunity, all
this
these-
is
all
the deal.
some of
Tomorrow I'm
these
going to
satellites
see
are
connecting with a friend.
And they provide
So
vital
that's,
services.
it's like,
right?
that's reserved.
So
And
is
then I have
there-
a date.
I don't know if
My
it's-
weekends are like
if that's
fun
more
for
fun, maybe a little bit
So, but you
mercenary
call me like
thinking
late
about
at
it,
night if
but
you
it's
want
not-
to,
it's
like,
not
or
out there,
I
all
call you,
this
I have your
stuff.
number.
Yeah, but I would like to
Like
talk.
he was saying,
We need to have a
the
tweet on Sunday,
contributions
but, let's talk.
Sunday's fine too. Sunday, I usually am
Yes.
free around
Theory,
after
free ball,
two.
to get up really quickly.
I'm meeting in the
Right.
morning.
Do that
I'll-
coverage. Or
I'll be
something.
gone 2 weeks,
All
but,
right, so that's
yeah,
the
let's
other
talk.
What about tonight?
I'm
Trying to get
picked up
this
right
together.
now.
Okay.
So I have to
Built
run.
out as
But,
quickly as.
yeah,
But
let's
that
talk
usually
soon.
is 3 or
Yeah,
4 years
okay.
in the Army or Air Force timeline. That's considered responsive space. And they're getting it up in 24 months and be like impossible to achieve. I'm thinking of, what would happen in the United States if you didn't have GPS for
You have to
2 or 4
really launch
years?
infrastructure that can get from A to B in less than.
Right, so well, nobody has the money to do that. First of all, the idea of thinking about it is like considered cuckoo, because, we always prepare to fight and win the last war.
This Cooper was building 2,000 nuclear missiles.
Well,